share this presentation later, and obviously, provide an opportunity for those that have been and were not able actually to join us today. So before we actually start, I just would like to do a little bit of a struggling here. Why? Got the chat button. Yeah. So just acknowledging that this session is the first session of a series of seminars that we are facilitating through the newly established Cycling Research Network. So it's a group that we are working towards trying to enhance the quality and impact of cycling-related research, not only biomechanics of cycling more generally, more broadly, but obviously I'm biased in probably one of the things that I wanted to bring forward, at least to start with, was something that I would be more familiarized, and obviously the session that will be, you have the opportunity to hear today is something that we definitely, all of us, have been looking forward for a while. And I just would like to introduce Gertjan Ettema. Apologies again for the spelling. So it is really a pleasure to have him speaking with us. He has been out there for a very long time. He's a very experienced biomechanist. He's a professor at NTU in Norway and has done a lot of work on cycling biomechanics and sports biomechanics in general, but also cycling biomechanics. And I think the intention of the talk is really trying to bring a bit of light to that topic. And without extending too much, I'll pass the word to Gertjan so he can move forward. I think I've muted you, sorry, when I was trying to mute everyone else.
I just unmuted myself.
Beautiful.
So yeah. I hope you can, you hear me. Yeah, okay. Well, thank you very much for first inviting me. I want to say good morning. Here in Europe, it's good morning. You are probably all at other places. This topic that I'm going to talk about, it's not based on the latest research that has been done. It is, well, it goes back to about maybe 10 or even 15 years ago and then longer ago, but it's about fundamentals of biomechanics in cycling. I'll come back to that, to what this talk is restricted about. I gave it a provocative title: Humans are not designed for cycling. And then, of course, an open question is not even rhetorical, right? I might be wrong. People might disagree with me. I'll get to, I'll try to explain why I go for that statement, that actually we're not designed for cycling. Another title might be aspect of smooth paddling, and in one of the papers that I looked up, the term circling is being used. We in Norway here, we have different expressions for these techniques of cycling, and then you try to translate it to English, and then you find there's no particular words for that or terms for that that is used by everyone. I looked up some YouTube videos and I Googled a bit to see if I was still up to date with what I'm going to talk about. Also, when thinking about practice, the experiments we did and the tests were done after having discussions with the cycling practice here in Norway, and with some cyclists and ex-cyclists that really know what they're doing, ex-professional cyclists, and they're working as trainers. So we discussed issues that were relevant and important for them to talk about. So a lot of this started from the practice side, although the scientific side initiation comes in there as well. I found this particular video. I won't run it. You can find it on YouTube. I put the link there, so later people can just find the link and watch it. I like the philosophy of it. It was about demonstrating to recreational cyclists how professionals get a smooth pedaling cycle And what I basically start with say is that you should let it come naturally. Don't try to do something by instruction that doesn't feel naturally. And I like that idea. That's not a scientific statement, just like an idea, and there you go. But often things in practice work a little bit like that, I guess. What I will talk about, at least in part, what the secret, it's not really a secret. It is, I think, well described in science, also in research on cycling, on the cycling technique. How you get this smooth cycle, or whether it really is a smooth pedaling cycle that you obtain. First of all, I'll talk in terms of models. In science, we always do that. We build a model, an idea of how the world works, and it's always a simplification. That's the real thing, and this is what I will talk about, and I'll restrict myself basically to this. Is the lower extremity pushing on a pedal. And the rest I will not talk about. So I won't talk about positioning of the trunk, the arms, etc., which may be just as relevant to what I will talk about. Just for being sure that we're on the same line when talking about the different words and terms. When the crank and pedal is on the top, in a cycle, we call it top dead center, or the bottom dead center. I refer to downstroke, or the push when you're in the front and moving down, in the upstroke, or the pull up when you're at the back. And I'll simplify it to something like this. I will show later a number of polar plots, which is not that often done in the literature, but I find them very, they visualize very well what's going on, instead of having XY plots of the pedaling cycle. The pedal cycle. You could ask yourself, people working with top dead center and bottom dead center, to being able to push through that as good and fast and strong as possible. I asked the question whether we should actually be worried about that you have these dead centers, and whether we should work with trying to minimize these ones. And the upstroke, the pull up. Should we really try to pull actively? That's one thing we work with an ex-professional cyclist, Atle Koolswol. He cycled the Tour de France 6 times, if I'm correct. In the team of Greg LeMond, also when Greg LeMond won the Tour de France, and he really knows what he's talking about. And we talked about this up pull and first studied whether that up pull, that upstroke, really existed, if cyclists really were doing that. The first thing we found when measuring pedal forces is there was no up force. And what he said, I might come back to that a little bit later. What he said basically concluded, if you can't measure any force in the upward direction up here, then you're probably measuring wrong. You might as well throw away these force cells that we constructed in the pedals. What we later discovered is that what the athletes were doing is they were not forcefully pulling up, but they were actually pulling up their own weight of the leg that was moving upward, instead of letting the other front leg push that back leg up. So we were actually measuring correctly, but we had a different, we were in different worlds, using different terms and different semantics, and a different experience of what an up pull or an upstroke was actually entailing. If you pull your own leg up, your back leg, instead of that your front leg is pushing that down, it already divides the workload over more muscle than if only using the downstroke and letting the back leg being just passively pushed up. I'm not saying that this is a good thing or a bad thing to do, but it's just an example of how practice and science sometimes not misunderstand each other, but using different terms and having different experiences and therefore misunderstanding occurs. Another one is where things easily are misunderstood is that if you look at a pedaling cycle, you might see at some cyclists that it looks very smooth kinematically. It seems like the pedal is never reducing speed, or the crank reducing speed or increasing speed. It goes in a continuous speed all the time. That is not the same as that the dynamics are equally smooth. We do not generate a pedaling force continuously over the 360 degrees, even though from the kinematics it may seem like that. Let's go back to some fundamentals first. The lower extremity, and here actually is the core of that secret that I was talking about. What is the lower extremity designed to do? It's designed to propel our body against the environment, move around basically. Whether you do it in a vertical jump testing, running up a hill, start of a sprint, what you see is that the forces, the ground reaction force, almost always runs between knee and hip. Here, the same thing, the push-up force will run in between knee and hip, close to the center of mass. And I don't know where the center of mass exactly is, but it's somewhere around the pelvic region. In this start of a sprint, it's the same thing. You'll never find something like this. If this force, these red arrows are generated, actually the configuration of the body would have been different, or the athlete is trying to make a backward somersault. So keep that in mind, that in most exercises, forceful exercises with the lower extremity, we extend the entire extremity and forces go in between the joints, including the ankle, but I'll not talk about the ankle today. If you do that in exercises like the vertical jump, we've seen that before, but also in an isolated knee extension or a leg press. A leg press, you'll see the same thing, independent on how the configuration of that press is being set up. I just made a silly drawing here, but what you basically see, if you are able to push heavy weights and feel really strong, that force factor will run between hip and knee and never outside of these two. In the knee extension exercise, which we often do in the lab, just strength testing, also in strength training, you might have a completely different situation where that force, if we try to move up the resistance, the reaction force will run below knee and hip, but you usually have either straps or your arms are able to hold on and build a fulcrum, so you get other forces that act on the body. And this problem of this force running far away from both joints is not a realistic problem. You solve it by stabilizing yourself in your seat. That is this one, and hereby I also not introduce, but I'll remind you of Newton's law of action and reaction. If we know what the action force is, that's the red arrow in this case, we often record actually the reaction force, like ground reaction forces. But if we know the reaction force, the blue line, we can also we also know what the action force is, what it is that muscles generate. Now, in this situation, the problem is not real, because you may be strapped, you may have stabilized by using the arms, holding on to the chair, etc. But if you would do the same exercise while sitting on a stool and not allowed your hands to hold on to something, you'll probably can imagine that you're much weaker. You cannot generate the same strength, even though your knee extensor muscles have not weakened in any way. But what you have in this situation is that that reaction force, the blue one, runs, or the whole force line runs below hip and knee, and they create what what is needed to create that force in that direction is knee extensor moments, but also hip flexor moments. And the hip flexor group is far weaker than knee extensor or hip extensors, and you are limited by the hip call it hip weakness, flexion weakness. The knee extensors are simply not allowed to turn on fully because your hip will basically buckle. This is a situation where you are not strapped in and you cannot generate the total, use your total capacity of the knee extensors to generate force. In jumping, we don't have that problem. It's both hip extensors and knee extensors that we need to also to create the right direction of force, that's in this case upward. In cycling, we might have this situation where there is no problem, but we might want to push forward and downward, and then the force factor runs close or maybe even behind the hip, and this is just a hypothetical example to show the point. And suddenly you need, in net terms, hip flexus moments instead of hip extensor moments, and you generate clearly a challenge. This one is more likely not to occur at the top of the pedal cycle, but somewhere later, where actually the reaction force from the pedal on the foot is pointing forward and you're pushing downward and backward, and the force factor runs in front of your knee, which suggests that you need knee flexus to generate not just the force, but also the direction of that force. Never forget that the force is a vector. It has a size, but it also has a direction. If we take a little, well, I'll call it a sidestep and define force effectiveness, it's basically defined as the total force or the perpendicular force on the crank, the propulsive force, the P can stand for propulsive or perpendicular, the blue arrows in the diagrams, divided by the total force that is being generated on the pedal, the black one. And then you can, of course, put it in all kinds of equations, and what you basically find that force effectiveness, the ratio of these two forces, is nothing different than the cosine of the angle between the perpendicular force, the mechanically ideal direction, and the actual force vector that is being generated. If we now look at force effectiveness in different parts of the pedal cycle, I put the how in parentheses deliberately, because you could also ask you the question not just how it works, but if it works at all, generating a high force effectiveness. That's often an idea also with the smooth pedaling cycle, that you try to generate propulsive forces all the time of, if not equal size, at least reasonable size, so that you get this smooth motion of the pedal cycle. The only part where there is no challenge for the lower extremity is in the first half of the downstroke, where the ideal, and those are the blue lines, they are perpendicular to the crank, where the ideal force with 100% force effectiveness actually has a force line that runs in between the knee and the hip. So you get a condition where if you simply turn on your knee extensors and your hip extensors, you will have a full capacity. The top dead center, the same applies for the bottom dead center in the opposite direction. You have a line that is running below knee and hip, and you have this challenge like I explained in the isolated knee extension. Oh, I clicked too fast. The second part of the downstroke, you have this challenge where you're actually trying to push downward and backwards to get this perpendicular force. If you would do that, you get a force factor that runs far in front of the knee, and you get a challenge. I'll try to explain that. Think of this bunch of sticks, that's the simplification in the model, is pinned in the the slide at the knee, and I have a rope that is according to this black arrow and the dotted line, and I pull on this rope, I would pull the knee into extension. Think of the ankle also purely fixed, so it's just a set of rods that can't move in the ankle, and it's pinned, fixed in the slide at the knee. If I pull on this rope like a puppet on a string, I would pull this knee into extension. Now, if the reaction force is pulling the joint into extension movement, then the action force doing the opposite must be trying to pull the knee in flexion. And if the forces try to generate a flexion movement, while the actual movement is extension, when you're pedaling the knee, it will extend in this position. You have a serious challenge of how you can do that. And this basically reduces the capacity to generate high forces in that direction. So in this second half of the downstroke, how does this work? What should we go for? Is it high effectiveness, trying to push downward and backward, strongly backward, or should we go for a high as much effective force, regardless of the angle phi that you might require to get such a force? I put down in red text just this challenge that this situation causes. You require, by the dynamics, you require knee extension moments, knee flexion moments, sorry. But you want actually knee extensors to shorten, because they can provide the work and the power in this position. Now, what might be the case that if you generate a force that is oriented according to the black arrow and has a force line in between, behind the knee and in front of the hip, in between knee and hip, that you might actually be able to naturally generate a far higher force that gives an effective force component that's actually bigger than the one that you generate if you try to only generate perpendicular forces. So the question then becomes, if I increase my phi, so reduce my force effectiveness, I might actually increase the total force with that as well. And the total propulsive force might actually be higher. I put a question mark there because this is, I have not done research on this, whether that is the case. But the hypothesis then is that the direction of force affects the maximal effective component. And this is based on papers that's from the early 90s, trying to explain the Lombard's paradox, which is that in the second part of the downstroke, where you have a force effector that is pointing downward and slightly backward, that actually the hamstring muscles are highly active. In an action where you forcefully try to extend the knee is not into flexion. That occurs far later in the upstroke. So what I suggest is that if you draw in red the line of action of the perfect perpendicular force, it runs way in front of the knee. If you draw a force vector that is easy to generate for the anatomical system because it runs nice and smoothly in between knee and hip, and here actually exactly in the middle, you might actually come to a compromise of what cyclists really are doing, is generate this force in black that runs, has a line of action slightly in front of the knee, but such that with the capacity that people are able to generate in these different conditions, with an effective force factor that is biggest. So bigger than the one where you push as hard as you can in a natural way, and that will lead to something like in the blue direction. But in between that anatomically ideal or easy to do, the mechanically ideal, you'll end up with a effective force component that is highest. So you might increase or maximize the capacity to get propulsive forces out. Just a little bit about this coordination thing. How does the lower extremity system solve this problem? As said, this first part of the downstroke is not a problem. Line of force runs in between hip and knee, and what you get is the knee extensors and the gluteus maximus. The hip extensor can be highly active, and you get a push in a direction that you actually desire, quite naturally. In the second part, the situation is different. If you turn on the hamstrings, as if it were a steel wire, it's not shortening or lengthening. In reality, it is actually shortening a bit, but not that much. What happens, you can imagine that if you would only have the vesti active, what happens is you extend the knee, so you kick your foot more or less forward, but by then having the hamstrings attached, that knee extension directly introduces a hip extension via a steel wire, and the foot will also move backward. And then you get the perfect, or you get actually the cycling, the pedaling motion. The foot is kicked forward, but then also down and backward by a coordinated hip extension. Now, this might be a very nice solution for a still pedaling ride, but it may also still limit the amount of force you can generate in that direction. And what I, just watching time, we're going all right, I guess. With this challenge that you have, not in the first part of the downstroke, but in the second part of the downstroke, the question is to cyclists, and I do not have the answer, although I do have my guess, but that guess is not based on pure science, is whether we should focus on this process, trying to get the force exactly in the right direction, or if we should trust on our nature and the perception of what we're doing and let it come naturally. I suggest that the possibility, at least, is quite large that after having learned cycling and do it for quite a long time, your body, the system, the neuromuscular system finds that optimal solution or something close to that. Quite, I wouldn't say easily, it's a process, but think of little kids learning to cycle. When they're 3, 4, 5 years of age, they want to learn to cycle. You put them on a bike, and in the first instance, they might even try to pedal backwards, and it doesn't work. And suddenly they got the hang of it, and they just ride away. No problems. They learn it quite quickly, this movement, and it seems to go by itself. So these details, such details like I presented here, might be part of that actually, that you quite easily find how to most not effectively generate forces, but in what way you can get the highest capacity out of it. At a certain cost, if you push in the according what it has been published in the literature quite often in more or less this direction of the black arrow, the number 1 arrow, then you have an investment, because not all force that you generate is used for propulsion. But remember that that component that is in line of the crank is a static component. It doesn't generate any movement, so it's actually associated to an isometric component of contraction. And isometric contractions are quite cheap metabolically. So it may not cost you metabolically that much. Just to an indication, this is some data from our own research, and here are these polar plots for the crank cycle. You're moving down forward, and then it's upward again. Here is force effectiveness plotted. On the outside of the polar plot, you have the value 1, which means a perfect force effectiveness. The force goes perpendicular to the crank. If you go closer to the center, that number becomes less and less and less. And this is a typical dead center period It's not at 12 o'clock or 6 o'clock, it's about 12:30 or something, and 6:30, where you have the lowest effectiveness, also the lowest total force. The force are very quite low, close to zero, and the same applies to power. So these butterflies basically indicate where the dead centers and where the peak powers and forces and effectiveness occur in the crank cycle. That there is a double cycle here, it's a butterfly, you get one here. This is basically the other leg, that when the leg that defines the coordination system is at the back, the other leg turns to the front and generates basically the same thing. So you get a kind of a mirror butterfly in here. Now, what I want to point out with these diagrams is that the force effectiveness indeed occurs in the first part of the downstroke, where it's easy to do. You just extend your leg, you just push. But the total force, the highest force, occurs in the second part of the downstroke. But it's less effective. You tend to move away from this perpendicular direction. You don't push that much backward. It's a little bit less backward than mechanically ideal. And as a result, you get the power that is somewhere in between. The peak power occurs a little bit past when your pedal is 90 degrees in front, to the front, pointing perfectly to the front. I just want to point out, and this is one paper then that is almost now 20 years ago. I guess Gruben must have done his PhD on this topic, because there's about 3 or 4 papers on this issue out by that group. And they studied more or less how these things are coordinated. And they studied rotating. This is from a study with moving pedal, but I also had the pedals static, and people being asked to push as hard as possible and trying to figure out in which direction they would push. And they went through a whole pedal cycle basically. And what they basically find is that the way people push tends to be as much as possible in between, and with a line of action in between hip and knee. There's some fluctuation, but it's depends maybe to some degree, but not a lot, to how hard they are asked to push. In these experiments, people were asked to push according to a template and generate particular forces, and finding out that in these directions, the highest forces were possible, but also that people tend to push in the same direction, in the same force path, independent on other tasks or constraints in the task. These are studies, data from our own studies, but they're not published. They almost, I guess, got forgotten a bit in all the publishing that we did in those years. What we did is have athletes on an incline. This is actually not cycling uphill, because they were on a cycle ergometer, but we just put it on an incline, so the whole configuration became like you were cycling upwards. But it's not uphill cycling, it's just standing still or sitting still and pedaling on an ergometer. But what you find is that if you plot the crank cycle relative to a global coordinate system, and it was quite accurate, we did it on different inclines, that the alpha incline comes back in a phase shift of the pedal cycle, whichever variable you would put on it. And here we looked at power, because that's one of the obvious ones to look at. That if you put people on a 5% incline, there would be a phase shift, the rotation of this butterfly, also 5%. Same thing we found if we played around with the seat, not so much the seat height, but the positioning. So we played around with seat a bit up and down, but also forward, backwards. So we basically rotated the seat, the hip, pelvic area to the crank with a number of degrees, backward and forward compared to the preferred one. And we find exactly the same thing. The pedal cycle characteristic doesn't change, it's just rotated with the same number of degrees as we basically rotated the entire lower extremity. What we did actually with it, and here the trunk comes in, we also moved the steering in the same direction so that the whole athlete was rotated in that configuration. Dead centers. They are some people focus on that, trying to minimize dead centers. I'm not sure. I'll keep it as an open question. I'm not going to tell cyclists what to do and what not to do, but these are just some thoughts that I suggest that in this case, well, that's not a suggestion. If you try to push perpendicular to the crank here horizontally, you need knee extensors, but hip flexors in net terms active. And that looks a little bit like that constrained knee extension exercise where you're sitting on a stool. You're clearly minimized in your capacity to generate force. The same applies to the bottom dead center, but then the situation for the joints is reversed. You need quite strong knee flexion to do this, and we're not that strong in that knee flexion. We're not designed to be strong there. So there's a minimum capacity to generate forces in that direction. And it's actually what you see with these dead centers, that it's not only the force and the power that's reduced, but the force effectiveness as well. You do not, athletes do not tend to push perfectly in these horizontal directions. The upstroke, I suggest that might be coming from a 2-stroke engine to a 4-stroke engine. Instead of, although the analogy does not go full, but you add an engine, its knee flexion, or I should say a lower extremity flexion muscles in propelling your bicycle. There's no problem with the direction of the force in that area. That runs nicely in between knee and hip, but you have a challenge that it's flexion instead of extension, and people are not built to flex the lower extremity forcefully. So you have a weaker engine. It's a capacity problem. And then the question, of course, arises, should one really focus on this up pull or upstroke, or just let it be? An advantage physiologically might be if you have an extra engine, you divide the requirement of generating power over more muscle, and that should, in principle, always help. Quite old research again. This was from, I guess the year is not in there, the mid 2000, about 2007 or something like that. The group from James Martin did some experiments on this, giving cyclists different instructions on how to pedal. Their normal pedaling, the way they preferred, an instruction by circling, getting this force even all the time, pulling, that's pulling up, that's this upstroke, or excessively pushing on the pedal when you're really able to do that. The evenness of torque distribution was best when pulling up as well, and it's not surprising if you have at the upstroke at least forces that are higher than usual, you probably get an even torque distribution over the whole cycle. The force effectiveness went up as well, because it tends to be quite low here if you do not pull at all. Then you get a force that is the weight of your leg that is pointing exactly in the wrong direction. So you get a -1 effectiveness instead of a +1 or -100%. So it's not surprising that these ones go up. But if you look at the cost, the metabolic cost and efficiency, what they found is that the preferred and the pushing, something that is naturally easy to do, had the highest efficiencies. And the other ones were clearly lower. So the argument here was that trying to do something that does not come naturally costs you more. The argument against that conclusion was that these were athletes that were not trained to do these other instructions. So it might be just an issue of not being trained for this. Now, very recently, the same group published a paper with Stephen Elmer as first author, where this is a case study. so we have to be careful, a case study on an amputee Paralympic athlete who cycles with one leg and is trained for that. So he's also trained for the upstroke, the up pull, because otherwise the pedal simply doesn't go round. Now what they did is put a counterweight on the other pedal that would mimic, and even it might not be a perfectly imitation of this other leg's weight, but they put another weight on the pedal, on the other pedal, so that would relieve the athlete from having to have an active up pull with his healthy leg. What they found is that this new condition, that's the white triangles, that is the novel and untrained condition. He never had trained for that. He had trained to pull the leg actively upwards and get the pedals round. What they basically found is that the metabolic cost for the power generated was lower over all powers they measured, which indicates that if you can avoid this upstroke, a movement that the leg is not designed for, you actually improve your the metabolic cost. You reduce the metabolic cost, which seems a smart thing to do. So this, I put it down. I have not read the paper in all detail. I had a brief information exchange with James Martin via email, so we have not discussed this. He told me he was not here, but he's going to watch the video later. So I don't know what he thinks about this. But I call this anecdotal evidence. Anecdotal because it's a case study, so you have to be very careful with that. But it's a well-trained athlete who knows what he's doing. But at the same time, strong evidence that the upstroke may be not something to focus on too much to improve your cycling performance. And this is actually a nice, I think, it can be an open debate. I'm not fully convinced that upstroke is pointless, but I think there is a clear limitation in what you can get out of it, because the system is not designed for it. I'm just watching my time because I had a few extra slides, but I think I'm gonna finish off with this. Yes, I'm gonna move through this because it was just an little extra if I had time left. I want to thank you for your attention. And my conclusion, which is not necessarily scientifically based, but there is some evidence for it, that if you want to have fun with cycling, you let it come naturally. I thank you very much.
Thank you. All right. Looks, thanks again. I think there was a great talk covering a bit of history as well, which I think it's important to revisit and consider, particularly when we try to move things forward. We've got a little bit of time, and I probably want to open for questions. We have some on the chat box, and I've got a couple from myself that I would like to put forward for discussion. I think one that has been provided on the chat was that what technology has been used for these studies? Have they used Leomo or something else?
Yes, that's self-built pedals that only work in the lab on an ergometer, potentially on a treadmill. They are, I'll can give you a PDF version of this presentation, or just a PowerPoint presentation that you can distribute. And those papers that are referred to have that described. It's so it's home built, but by an engineer who knows what he's doing. 2 force cells in perpendicular direction that measure forces in both vertical and horizontal direction on the pedal. And then with we used the motion capture OCUS system to also have the orientation of the pedal and everything, so we can calculate not just the size of the force but the direction. I guess most systems that are available for cycling in general can record power quite accurately, also during the whole cycle, but not force effectiveness or force direction. So these are home built. it's a huge, well, not a huge block, but quite a big block under the pedal, which means that you can't use it on the road. It's really for research purposes.
Good, thank you. Yeah, there was a couple of mentions on the chat around brands, particularly. Not sure whether we want to comment on particular brands. I've got a bit of experience with the Sense6 crankset, but I think everybody has. Ina mentioned about the Red Label system from Germany. But yeah, I think in principle they probably should provide very similar type of information, really.
Yeah.
Yeah. Right. Look, I've got a couple of questions that I probably want to bring forward. Ones that I think it was really nice to see when you mentioned around the smooth technique, and particularly because you indicated around how we sometimes try to look at the same thing from two different lenses. So one, the coaches and cyclists looking at that smooth technique, thinking about the movement pattern. And when we look at the forces, we look at the dynamics, and there are different beasts, really. What is have we been into, and I'll pull everybody together, we in the science of sense or side of the conversation, and coaches and athletes from the other side, I'll bring them all together as guilty on that. Have we confused smoothness looking at the wrong outcome, which means is smoothness, or should smoothness be measured in terms of the angular velocity, so the kinematics, rather than the dynamics? Not sure if my question is sufficiently clear.
Yeah. The thing is that smoothness, well, if you have these power cramps, you had, I'm familiar with the SRM, and there's many others now that can properly record the power cycle. You at least get a good feel of how even that power generation is over the cycle. We had used a ergometer cycle that had that built in. It's not produced anymore. But what we discovered, we put on that bike our own force pedals with the 4 cells. And what we found is that what that product produced in these butterflies, that was similar, but I'll just click a little bit back. These kind of butterflies, well, let's get a power one on. Like there. These power butterflies that we found, they have quite deep dead centers where the power almost was reduced to 0. What on the same exercise, so we measured both the ergometer itself and our own from our own 4 cells, is you would see similar butterflies that were much smoother, which gave us the idea. We'd never figured that out because it was a commercial product, that these butterflies were highly filtered and averaged over time. And then, of course, these dead centers get reduced. They might have gone to the 200 or 250 watts instead of here. It may be only 50. And then if you then look at these pedal cycles, it might seem very smooth, while in reality it's not. And that is the commercial product is in between. So you have to be very careful, I guess, and that is across the line. So I'm not up to date with all the products that are out there, is how these data that are recorded, how they are filtered before they're displayed to the athlete and the coach. And if that is a black box, I'm not totally sure how honest these different producers or manufacturers are. I just don't know. So you should at least be careful with that. The power cycle, I think, is a very nice one to look at, because in the end, it's the power that propels you, and whether it's with less or more effective force, I don't think that is the key. But whether you should then go for getting that power cycle as even as possible, I don't think that is the way to go, because athletes will never be able to do that, because you go cycle unnaturally. And you may be able to do that in the end, but your total power will go strongly down. If the dynamics also in terms of power are not even, are not smooth in that sense. What you'll find is, because forces are integrated to speed and position, what you then find is that this unevenness is less in the speed of the pedal cycle. So you might see a very even pedal cycle in speed, that the angular velocity of the pedals is quite constant, and still behind that there's quite an uneven power cycle. And I'm not totally sure if athletes should really focus too much on that, on changing the technique that comes natural to them. Of course, if you record these things, you might find quite anomalies, things that are really off, and you might then consider if you could do something with that. But I don't think in general to get a cycle as even as possible is the purpose, the way to go. Yes. I think James Martin was quite obvious with that study that the pull up is not the way to go. Right? I'm not sure if it's his research, not mine, if I would be so blunt in that conclusion, but there is something in there. Focusing, for example, on the upstroke to get it more even heavily, you might be missing the point, let's put it that way. And the might is important in that sentence.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think there's a little bit, and probably following on from there, which I think is probably our very last question due to time. Jose has asked on the chat whether what are your views around topics about pedal forces that may still need investigation, and if there is any potential research about effects of feedback in training that could be interesting.
In terms of the research, so call it a classic scientist. I like the fundamental work, understanding how things work. And I personally, but that is in my position as an academic, I'm less concerned with the implications and the implementations in practice. I'm not saying that that is not important, but it's not what I myself work so much with. So measuring all these forces on the pedals is important for us scientists to understand what's going on actually. And it may be, as very often in sports science as well, that a practitioner says, yes, okay, you've shown something that we actually, without ever having seen it, we actually knew already. Right? So we have to be, as scientists, also be careful with trying to tell athletes and coaches what to do because we find something. It's, but you need to do these measurements to figure out what's actually going on. As said with Upler Coleswell, we had this discussion and we finally agreed that these athletes were pulling up just the weight of their leg when going up, instead of pulling forcefully on the pedal. But it feels like that because you're active, instead of then letting the other, the front leg push up that leg. And just understanding that that is what athletes do. You need to do some measurements to realize that. And then you're talking, then you're communicating at an equal level. So yes, I don't know with these power equipment. Of course, it's important for cyclists to know what kind of power they're actually producing. Just that, whether it's an even power cycle or not, it becomes a detail, and often details are important. Becomes less important than knowing at what intensity you're working.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's an important thing, and obviously we probably need to make good decisions around what research we will concentrate. Because as you said, it's probably biased, but it's probably obvious that some things have been covered and are clear, but yeah, moving forward and translating that to the coaches is another challenge. Really. Yeah. Wonderful, thanks, Gertjan, and thank you all for coming. I'll stop recording.